The scruffy man in the tattered flannel walked into the diner, drawing only sneers and whispers. But when the crowd outside began shouting his name, Lindsey froze. What had she missed? How could someone so ordinary ignite such chaos? If you appreciate stories that celebrate real human values, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's continue. The diner buzzed with its usual chatter, forks clinking against plates and the occasional scrape of a chair against the floor. Mel sat quietly at the corner booth, his presence unassuming, his worn flannel blending into the muted tones of the diner's outdated decor. Lindsey, watching him from behind the counter, couldn't resist sneering. To her, he was just another nobody, a scruffy old man who didn't belong in her world of bigger dreams and imagined sophistication. "What do you think his story is?" her coworker whispered, half stifling a laugh. "A drifter? Maybe just cheap?" Lindsey smirked, her voice dripping with condescension. "More like broke. Probably spent his last dollar on that coffee." Mel, however, paid no mind to the quiet ridicule directed his way. He sat with his hands folded, occasionally glancing out the window as though he had all the time in the world. It wasn't the indifference of arrogance, but something gentler, as though he carried the weight of knowing more than he let on. At one point, a young boy at a nearby table dropped his toy, sending it skittering across the floor. Mel bent down without hesitation, retrieving the toy with a soft smile and a reassuring, "Here you go, buddy." The boy grinned, his mother offering Mel a grateful nod. Lindsey saw it and rolled her eyes. Great, now he's playing the saint. As if that's going to get him a free meal. The hypocrisy in Lindsey's disdain was glaring, though she remained blind to it. She fancied herself someone who understood class and ambition. Yet here she was, stuck in the very town she claimed to despise, serving customers she silently mocked. Her frustration with her own life bled into her judgment of others, and Mel became an easy target, someone she could look down on to feel a sliver of superiority. Yet, beneath her bravado, there was a deep insecurity she refused to confront. She clung to the illusion that the world owed her more simply because she felt she deserved it. Meanwhile, Mel's presence began to draw quiet attention from the older couple seated a few booths away. They exchanged glances, their whispers barely audible, but laced with a hint of recognition. The man furrowed his brow, his eyes darting toward Mel with curiosity. "Doesn't he look familiar?" the woman murmured. Lindsey caught snippets of their conversation, but dismissed it as idle gossip. "They're probably just bored," she muttered to her coworker, who shrugged and went back to scrolling on her phone. What struck Lindsey most, and irritated her even more, was Mel's calm demeanor. He didn't seem fazed by her coldness or the occasional stares from other patrons. It was as if he carried himself with an unshakable sense of purpose, a quiet strength that made her snide comments feel small and insignificant. But it was that very confidence, that refusal to be rattled, that gnawed at her. She couldn't place why, but there was something about him that made her uncomfortable. Something she couldn't quite ignore. The hum of the diner grew louder as the lunch rush began to trickle in. But Lindsey's irritation remained fixed on the man at the corner booth. She approached his table, balancing a coffee and sandwich on her tray, her disinterest palpable. Without a word, she set the plate down, her gaze drifting past him as if he weren't worth her attention. Under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, she muttered, "Hope you can afford this." She didn't even flinch as she turned to leave, expecting no reaction. Mel, unfazed, offered a faint smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm and steady. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You having a rough day?" Lindsey froze for a moment, caught off guard by his response. She spun back toward him, crossing her arms and raising a brow. "Rough year," she snapped, her tone sharp and dismissive. "But I'm sure you wouldn't understand." She didn't wait for a reply, walking away with an air of self-importance, her shoulders stiff and head high, as if the interaction had affirmed her superiority. As she returned to the counter, her coworker gave her a questioning glance. What did he say? Lindsey shrugged. Nothing worth repeating. Just another one of those types. Too much time, not enough money. She busied herself wiping down the counter, but couldn't help overhearing the older couple seated nearby. Their quiet murmurs carried an air of curiosity, the kind that irritated her because it didn't involve her. Is that really him? The woman whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Can't be. The man replied, though his tone suggested doubt. What would he be doing in a place like this? Lindsey frowned, stealing a glance at the couple. They were staring at the man in the flannel shirt, their expressions a mix of awe and puzzlement. Lindsey shook her head and smirked. They probably think he's some celebrity, she muttered under her breath to her coworker who chuckled. In this town? Please. Minutes passed, and Lindsey found herself inexplicably drawn to the man, her irritation giving way to curiosity. Something about his calm demeanor, his refusal to react to her barbs, unsettled her. But she pushed the thought aside, reassuring herself that he was nobody of consequence. That illusion shattered moments later when a commotion erupted outside. A small group of people had gathered near the diner's window, their phones held high, faces pressed against the glass. Murmurs grew into excited whispers, some pointing directly at the man in the corner booth. Lindsey felt her stomach tighten, her irritation now mingled with confusion. She squinted toward the window, trying to make sense of the sudden attention. The man remained seated, his expression unchanged, as though he were oblivious to the growing crowd. Lindsey's heart raced as she studied him more closely. Who was he? Why were people so interested in him? And, more importantly, what had she missed? The growing buzz outside the diner was impossible to ignore. Customers craned their necks toward the windows, whispering and pointing, while Lindsey tried to act indifferent, though her curiosity gnawed at her. Finally, unable to stand the tension, she stomped over to the man in the corner booth, her irritation bubbling over into open confrontation. All right, she snapped, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Who are you? Why is everyone staring at you like you're some big shot? She crossed her arms, her posture rigid, trying to maintain the upper hand in a situation she clearly didn't understand. The man looked up from his coffee, his calm, weathered face betraying nothing. For a moment, he hesitated, as though debating how to respond. Then he shrugged, his voice quiet but steady. Just a guy grabbing lunch, he said, his tone devoid of arrogance or defensiveness. Didn't mean to cause a stir. His humility only irritated Lindsey more. She opened her mouth to fire back when her coworker burst into the scene, nearly dropping her phone in excitement. Lindsey, she hissed, her voice high-pitched and trembling. Do you even know who that is? Lindsey turned, her brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? The coworker shoved her phone in Lindsey's face, her hands shaking. On the screen was a photo, unmistakably the same man sitting before them, though dressed for a red carpet. The caption read, Mel Gibson spotted in small-town diner. Lindsey blinked, her brain scrambling to process the information. The name hit her like a slap, the realization both humiliating and dizzying. Oh my God, her coworker whispered again, louder this time. That's Mel Gibson. The Mel Gibson. The words seemed to echo through the diner, and as if on cue, the entire room fell silent. Several customers stood up, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. Lindsey felt the blood drain from her face, her smug confidence evaporating in an instant. The actor, she stammered, her voice barely audible. The director? She looked back at Mel, who offered a sheepish smile, his expression unassuming despite the growing attention. Guilty as charged, he said lightly, as though the admission were no more significant than confirming his order. Lindsey's mind raced, her earlier behavior replaying in her head like a bad movie. The snide comments, the dismissive tone, the judgment. She had treated one of the most famous men in the world as though he were beneath her. Desperate to regain control, she blurted out, "What's someone like you doing here? Shouldn't you be in Hollywood or something?" Her words were meant to deflect, but they only highlighted her disbelief and insecurity. Mel's expression softened, his gaze steady but distant. "Sometimes it's nice to get away," he replied. His voice carried a weight that Lindsey couldn't quite place, a flicker of sadness behind his humility. The room remained still, the air thick with unanswered questions. What was he running from or searching for? And why did he seem so burdened? The crowd outside swelled, their eager faces pressed against the windows, some holding up phones to snap photos or record videos. Inside the diner, the atmosphere buzzed with whispers and stolen glances, the air thick with a mix of awe and curiosity. Lindsey stood behind the counter, her chest tightening as she watched the man she had so casually dismissed become the center of attention. Each new face pressed to the glass seemed like another nail in the coffin of her pride, a harsh reminder of how cruelly she had misjudged him. The thought gnawed at her until she couldn't stand it any longer. She approached him again, her steps slower this time, her voice lacking the sharp edge she had wielded earlier. "I didn't mean to, treat you like that," she began awkwardly, her words faltering as she glanced at his face. "I just didn't realize." Mel looked up from his coffee, his expression unchanged, calm, patient, as though he had seen this all before. "No harm done," he said simply. "I'm used to people jumping to conclusions." The word stung, even though he didn't say them cruelly. Lindsey felt the weight of them settle on her, heavy and unrelenting. She fidgeted, unsure of what to say next. "Why are you here anyway?" she blurted out, her tone tinged with frustration. "This town's got nothing special." Mel's gaze shifted toward the window, his blue eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the growing crowd outside. For a moment, he didn't answer, as though lost in thought. Then he turned back to her, his voice quiet but steady. "I came to visit a friend," he said. "Someone who reminded me what matters in life." Lindsey frowned, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What do you mean by that?" she pressed, her tone edging toward impatience. She had always thought of celebrities as people who lived perfect lives, untouched by the struggles that plagued ordinary people like her. The idea that someone like him might have regrets or doubts felt almost absurd. Mel's expression softened, his features taking on a contemplative look. "Fame," he began, his voice dropping, "isn't what people think it is. It can pull you away from the things that matter. Family, values, faith. You think you have everything, and then one day you realize you're losing it all because you forgot what's important." His words landed like a punch, and for a moment Lindsey couldn't speak. The vulnerability in his tone, the raw honesty of his admission, caught her off guard. She had never considered the cost of a life like his, blinded by her assumptions about wealth and fame. "What did you lose?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But Mel didn't answer right away, his gaze returning to the crowd outside. The weight of his silence spoke volumes, leaving Lindsey with questions she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answers to. The crowd outside had grown to an almost unbearable size, their voices rising in excited chatter, pressing against the glass like moths drawn to a flame. Inside, the tension was palpable. "Joe?" The elderly diner owner wrung his hands nervously, his calm demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. "Mel," he said, his voice tight, "you've got to go. This is getting out of hand." "I can't have this here." Mel stood slowly, his movements deliberate, unhurried. Despite the chaos, he seemed entirely at peace, a stark contrast to the frenzied energy around him. As he reached for his cap, preparing to leave, Lindsey stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Wait," she said, her tone wavering, unsure but insistent. Mel paused, turning to face her, his expression calm and patient. Lindsey swallowed hard, her earlier bravado nowhere to be found. "You've been through all that," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the window, "and you still take the time to help people? Like that kid earlier? Why?" Her question hung in the air, more than curiosity lacing her words. There was desperation too, a need to understand something she couldn't quite grasp. Mel looked her directly in the eye, his gaze steady but kind. "Because no matter who you are," he said, his voice warm but firm, "it's how you treat people that matters. The little things add up. You'd be surprised what kindness can do." His words struck her like a bolt, simple but profound, cutting through the layers of cynicism she had built around herself. Before she could respond, the door creaked open, and a small boy slipped inside, clutching a crumpled piece of paper and a pen. His wide eyes darted nervously between Mel and the crowd outside, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Mr. Gibson," the boy said, barely above a whisper, "can I have your autograph?" Mel's face softened, the lines of age and weariness giving way to something lighter, almost joyful. He knelt down, taking the paper and pen with gentle hands. "Of course," he said, his tone reassuring. "What's your name, buddy?" The boy beamed as Mel carefully signed his name, handing the paper back with a wink. Lindsey watched the interaction, her heart twisting in a way she didn't expect. There was no pretense in Mel's actions, no hint of arrogance or obligation. He didn't seem to care about the cameras outside or the whispers in the diner. His focus was entirely on the boy, on making a moment of kindness count. It was a stark contrast to everything Lindsey had told herself about people like him, about the world in general. For years, she had clung to her bitterness, her belief that people were selfish and shallow. But now, watching Mel, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that maybe the problem wasn't with the world, it was with her. As Mel stood to leave, tipping his cap to the boy, Lindsey felt something shift inside her, a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Would she let this moment change her, or would she hold on to the safety of her cynicism? The commotion in the diner had settled into an almost reverent silence as Mel stood, preparing to leave. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of all that had been unsaid. Lindsey stood frozen behind the counter, her mind racing as she replayed every moment she had misjudged him. Finally, she found her voice, though it wavered as she spoke. "Wait," she said, stepping forward, her cheeks flushed with shame. "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I even knew you." Her words hung awkwardly in the air, and for a moment, she braced herself for dismissal or anger. But Mel turned to her, his expression soft, his eyes full of understanding. "We've all been there," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. "What matters is what you do next." The words hit her like a freight train, stripping away every excuse she had built for herself. Lindsey stood there, feeling raw, vulnerable, and for the first time in years, open to the possibility that she didn't have to be defined by her bitterness. She nodded, swallowing hard. "You know," she said, her voice quieter now, "you're nothing like I thought you'd be." Mel chuckled softly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I get that a lot," he said, tipping his cap. "Take care of yourself, Lindsey." As Mel walked toward the door, the crowd outside erupted into cheers and waves, phones flashing as he stepped into the sunlight. Lindsey moved to the window, watching him disappear into the throng. There was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet dignity in his every movement, that left her both inspired and unsettled. He wasn't just a famous actor or director. He was a man who had faced his flaws, who had lost sight of what mattered, but had fought to reclaim it. He had come here not to flaunt his status, but to reconnect with the simple life, the values that had once grounded him. And he had done it with humility, grace, and kindness. Lindsey's throat tightened as she stared out at the street, her reflection faint in the glass. She felt something stir deep within her, something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of determination, a desire to be better. Her entire life had been defined by her entitlement, her belief that the world owed her more simply because she existed. But watching Mel had shattered that illusion, forcing her to confront the truth she had long avoided. Change wasn't something handed to you. It was something you had to choose. Joe shuffled up beside her, his hands stuffed into his apron pockets, his expression thoughtful as he too watched the crowd outside. You think people like him ever come back? Lindsey asked, her voice thick with emotion. Joe chuckled, his eyes twinkling. Who knows, he said, his tone warm and knowing. But if they do, you'd better be ready to serve them right. Lindsey nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Please don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories that are showing on your screen. For more stories celebrating real human values, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss our next uploads.